Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and this video is a response to Matt Taibbi's recent essay, Marcuse-Anon, Cult of the Pseudo-Intellectual. And it's an exploration of the difficulties that Marcuse was facing during his lifetime. Specifically, we'll take a look at some of the ways Marcuse's writings and ideas fit within the context of the struggle for socialism, and at the problems and realities Marcuse was attempting to address. Along the way, I'll take an excerpt from Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism in an attempt to understand how Marcuse's critiques of the post-war consumer landscape developed into 21st century anti-capitalism. In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx wrote that world history repeats itself. He observed that Hegel was right when he asserted that all great world historic facts and personages appear twice. But, Marx said, Hegel forgot to add that the first time history appears as a tragedy, while the second time history appears as a farce. In 2021, we would be lucky if historical events only happened twice. Today, history is like a skipping record, or like a YouTube video set to loop. But being stuck in the same pattern does have some advantages. It provides those of us who aren't amongst the corpses to notice patterns, to look for structures. It's like watching reruns of what might have originally been a compelling TV drama. By the fifth or sixth viewing, a sort of Brechtian alienation takes hold. You stop trying to figure out who the good guys are, stop rooting for a team, and start to wonder about the scriptwriters, about TV tropes, about the history of NBC. This sense of deja vu can give you some emotional distance from the material on your news feed on Facebook or on the cable news channels, and even from essays published on Substack. And this is how I felt when I read Matt Taibbi's essay on Marcuse. It's how I feel when I read Taibbi's critiques of woke culture generally.
I think a lot of us in journalism are coming around slowly to the fact that we missed some big stories. You know, people like me, I think, owe people like you an apology for coming around to this late, if anything. Yeah, all the people who used to be fans of mine who would have objected, they're long gone already. So
right, yeah, that's the thing. I still got to fight. I can still reach some people, Matt.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's very frustrating, and we're going to talk about this with we're going to talk.
The left has criticized the authoritarianism involved in its own projects from the very beginning. Marx critiqued the utopians for their insistence that socialism could be brought about through the development of various, often Christian or Christianized ideologies. The anarchists critiqued Marx for his vanguardism and his embrace of the state. The socialist Eugene Debs criticized the progressives for their moralizing and ineffectual efforts to rid society of vices through legal restrictions such as prohibition. Today's current debate on the left, a debate sometimes characterized as a fight between woke and anti-woke players, dates back to at least the 90s. For example, Christopher Lasch in his book Revolt of the Elites pointed out that political correctness on college campuses, the attempts to police language, only led to an entrenchment of racist attitudes amongst the lower and middle white working classes. Howard Zinn used to say that you can't ever be neutral on a moving train, but if you find out the train is running on a circular track, it might be time to do more than just react. And it's for this reason that this video is not going to be an attempt to judge Matt Taibbi or Marcuse as people. It is not even going to be an attempt to judge them as writers or thinkers. At least, I'm going to try to avoid judging them, because to do so implies that there is a correct position that is already known, that I already have in my possession. Unfortunately, that is, instead of judging Marcuse and Taibbi as if I know what is true in advance, This video will try to point out the questions and problems that Marcuse and Taibi share in common. It should be possible. Even though the two men don't have a common conception of the world, they are both facing problems born out of the same system, even though they face these problems from dramatically different moments in history. Having said that, if you're remotely familiar with Marcuse and the Frankfurt School in general, it's easy to read Taibi's essay as a symptom of the very one-dimensionality that Marcuse complains about. For example, when he described Marcuse as being disillusioned after World War I, despite not having himself experienced combat, when he described Marcuse as obsessed with the question, what form of Marxism would eventually triumph across the civilized world, was not only being unfair to Marcuse, but he was also flattening out history, ignoring how the bourgeois revolutions of the 19th century were intertwined with struggles for socialism, and how even the most bourgeois dreams of the 19th century were smashed to pieces in the 20th. Taibi cherry-picks quotes from Marcuse, and in so doing, he misses an opportunity to critique Marcuse more adequately. For example, Taibi quotes Marcuse from One-Dimensional Man. Quote, "Independence of thought, autonomy, and the right to political opposition are being deprived of their basic critical function in a society which seems capable of satisfying the needs of the individuals through the way in which it is organized. Such a society may justly demand acceptance of its principles and institutions." End quote. But what Taibi leaves out here is how Marcuse's vision of socialism is precisely the development of social relations and techniques that can satisfy the needs of the people. Freedom for Marcuse must include freedom from want. What Marcuse is wrestling with is how it could be that a rising standard of living was not leading to the development of free individuals. Why were people working just as much as before? Why was society still divided against itself? And that is, both externally between nations and internally along ethnic and class lines. What Marcuse wanted to know after 2 world wars was how it could be that increasingly powerful engines of production and technological sciences weren't leading to liberation, but to the threat of annihilation. In order to understand Marcuse's work, you have to see him through the lens of history, or really through 2 lenses. His ideas were the result of the history of bourgeois development and of the history of Marxism. The horror of the trenches, the machine gun, the Holocaust, and the atom bomb are well known. What is less well known is the horror of the Belle Epoque and the terror of pop. Starting in the late 19th century, the struggle for socialism had been in crisis. Rather than the contradictions of capitalism leading to a workers' revolution, the Long Depression had led to a new boom. In the Second International, there was a debate about this crisis within Marxism, about how the new economic conditions seemed to discredit Marxist ideas about how capitalism produces its own gravediggers. Edward Bernstein argued that there was no longer a need for revolution, but that socialists could find a path out of a class society through electoral politics, the stock market, increased production, and the rational management of both production and distribution. By the end of the Second World War, Bernstein appeared to have been proven at least half right. The contradictions in capitalism could be overcome by what nearly everyone recognized to be state capitalism. The fascists, the Soviets, and Fordist Americans were all functioning in the same way. The old way of letting capitalism manage itself through competition in the market was dead. Monopoly capital, when working with the state, could rationally plan for the future. Rational planning was happening, and the technocrats were working around the clock. The Americans had announced that production for use, that is, true rational planning, was around the corner, and the technological tools needed to create a post-scarcity society were already made. And yet, rather than a world of freedom, Marcuse found an America filled with smiling conformists at home and military troops that called themselves advisors abroad. What Taibi misses is that Marcuse, far from being a dogmatic Marxist, had turned away from Marx and revolution both. in an effort to hold on to a technocratic vision of socialism that, while at times thrilling and even beautiful, did not really inform a struggle for socialism.
We've talked in general terms and about the Frankfurt School. I mentioned 2 or 3 of the individuals in my opening remarks, but I think it would be especially interesting to hear just a word from you about who the main individuals were and what they were like, because after all they were your close friends and associates.
Well, Horkheimer was the director of the institute, Adorno, a genius. Then are those who are unjustly neglected or forgotten. Frederick Pollock and especially Hendrik Grossman, the most orthodox of all Marxist economists I have ever met. He predicted the collapse of capitalism for a very specific year he gave. In the meantime, it turned out it wasn't quite correct.
Like the medieval churchmen predicting the end of the
exactly,
world. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And Pollock, who after all wrote, I think, the first article, in which he tried to argue that there are no compelling internal reasons why capitalism should collapse.
In an essay entitled Marcuse Among the Technocrats, America, Automation, and Post-Capitalist Utopias, J. Jesse Ramirez argues that Marcuse was, like the rest of the Frankfurt School, working within the economic theory of Frederick Pollock. And Pollock, like Bernstein, believed that the aim of socialism was to create a new mode of distribution that could complement industrial production with the social ownership of wealth. However, unlike the rest of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse made more of an attempt to hold on to his optimism about the possibility of evolutionary socialism. Further, he rejected the idea that the exploitation inherent in capitalism could be dissolved in the ways that Bernstein described, insomuch as Marcuse asserted that capital was still produced and appropriated by private individuals, whether those individuals were Soviet bureaucrats or CEOs. What was necessary, however, was not the development of a proletarian force that could dictate a change in production and set up a truly new form of society, but rather the continued maintenance of the welfare state, support for the unemployable and the victims of racist exclusion, and holding on to an admittedly irrational hope. In 2009, Mark Fisher, in his book Capitalist Realism, claimed that capitalism is what is left when beliefs have collapsed at the level of ritual or symbolic elaboration, and all that is left is a consumer spectator trudging through the ruins and the relics. To set up this assertion, he quoted from the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "Capital has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation." What's worth noticing is that what Fisher quotes with sorrow, Marx wrote with excitement. For Marx, the fact that the old illusions and rituals had been stripped away and brutal exploitation made plain was to be celebrated because these conditions of naked exploitation and brutal egoism would not long be tolerated. But according to Fisher, socialism had been put off indefinitely because what replaced the old ideologies, beliefs, and rituals was a cultural torpor and acquiescence. Rather than finding a new subjectivity, we were instead immersed in capitalist realism. Marcuse likewise believed that the struggle for socialism had been replaced by a semi-permanent capitalist ideology, an ideology that could maintain power and stave off a transformation. He believed that freedom from want and oppression was technically feasible, but oppression and exploitation would continue nonetheless. From the vantage point of 2021, it's easy to see that while a post-scarcity world may technically be possible, if we only consider the forces of production, the social relations that are maintained in order to reproduce those forces still seem necessary, even as our global society can no longer promise to produce ever-rising standards of living, or to suppress the threat of world war, nor even maintain the possibility of a quiet life of conformity in the suburbs. We have reached a point where the old assumptions of both the socialists and the bourgeoisie have been smashed to pieces. This brings us back to Taibi. Clearly, from our perspective in 2021, there can be no sensible argument for calling for the suppression of the right to assemble and the right to think. Marcuse's idea that students might be able to help bring socialism along by suppressing the dominant ideology of society on campus was ludicrous at the time, but even this argument from Marcuse should be understood in the context of the moment it was written. Marcuse was addressing a student movement that was attempting to stop their own recruitment into the U.S. military-industrial complex, a military-industrial complex that was invading Vietnam, and that was attempting to alter a university system that was to turn their intellectual work into horrific weapons and programs. In that context, Marcuse's mistake, while still a mistake, is a bit more understandable. As for Taibi's claim that Marcuse wanted to create a dictatorship of intellectuals, this is far from charitable. His comments on the poverty of U.S. education, on the necessity for valuing the sort of education that goes beyond training and technical skills, but helps students and citizens develop an understanding of the context of their lives, an education that might empower them to change that context, again, has to be understood not as a call for the unwashed to shut up, but for the current administrators, get out of the way. This, again, was written a year after Mario Savio, speaking for the free speech movement, complained that the president of Berkeley University had compared the university to a business firm.
We were told the following: if President Kerr actually tried to get something more liberal out of the regents in his telephone conversations, why didn't he make some public statement to that effect? And the answer we received from a well-meaning liberal was the following. He said, would you ever imagine the manager of a firm making a statement publicly in opposition to his board of directors? That's the answer. Well, I ask you to consider, if this is a firm, and if the Board of Regents are the Board of Directors, and if President Kerr, in fact, is the manager, then I tell you something, the faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw materials. But we're a bunch of raw materials that don't mean to have any process upon us, don't mean to be made into any product, don't mean to end up being bought by some clients of the university, be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone. We're human beings.
On one point, however, Taibi is clearly correct. When he writes that capitalism and its political representatives in the Democratic Party can and have absorbed Marcuse and his books into itself, that his one-dimensional man and his essays on tolerance can be used as bludgeons against the ordinary average guys and gals who are becoming increasingly fed up with the precarity of life over the last 20 years of what was called the new normal. That the very society of unfreedom that he feared can now use his face and his decontextualized ideas to justify the last gasps of the administration of a now neoliberal state capitalism. Taibi lands a death blow. In his final line, he says that we might laugh at the irony of the way Marcuse has been recuperated, but he claims that Marcuse himself could never get the joke. Can we? Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.